The wind cut across the plains like a sharpened blade, carrying with it needles of ice that stung every inch of exposed skin. The sun had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by the thickest storm Eva had ever seen. Snow twisted through the air in furious spirals, erasing the world around her step by step until the road vanished beneath white drifts. The sky rumbled with a distant growl, as if warning her to turn back, but she had nowhere to turn back to. Eva clutched her baby girl tighter against her chest, shielding the tiny body beneath the last dry quilt she owned. The child whimpered softly, her breaths uneven, her cheeks too cold for Eva's comfort. Panic scraped at her throat, urging her to move faster, but her steps grew slower with every mile. The horse she'd been riding had collapsed 2 hours earlier, legs trembling from exhaustion. Eva hadn't even had time to mourn the loss of her only transportation. Desperation pushed her forward on foot. Her boots sank deep into the snow with each step. Her fingers, stiff with cold, trembled violently as she adjusted the quilt to keep the snow off the baby's face. The child was only a few months old, too small to fight against a storm like this, too small to survive another night outdoors. Eva whispered reassurances, even though the wind snatched the words from her lips. Before they reached the baby's ears, she had left the last town behind days ago, fleeing dangers she never imagined. She'd face a threat that turned her from a quiet homestead wife into a wandering mother with no certainty left in her life. But even fear of pursuit paled in comparison to the icy claws of this storm. Just when Eva thought her knees would give out and she'd collapse right there in the snow, something flickered in the distance. A light, faint, swaying, golden like a lantern fighting the wind. Her breath caught. It could have been a mirage, a cruel trick of the storm, but she couldn't risk ignoring it. She angled toward the glow, forcing her frozen legs to keep moving. As she approached, the shape of a small ranch house slowly materialized through the white haze. The roof sagged under layers of snow, but smoke curled from the chimney warmth. Life, hope. Her vision blurred with tears, which froze before they could fall. Reaching the porch steps felt like dragging a mountain behind her. She clung to the railing as her strength finally betrayed her. With numb fingers, she raised her hand and knocked. Once, twice, she didn't have the strength for a third. The door remained closed for a long, agonizing moment. Eva began to tremble, not from cold this time, but from the fear that no one would answer, that she had reached salvation too late. Then the door creaked open. Warm light spilled out, cutting through the storm. A tall silhouette filled the doorway, a broad-shouldered man with rough hands and a steady stillness about him. His expression was unreadable in the dim light behind him, but his eyes were sharp, alert, and impossibly calm for a night like this. Eva tried to speak, to explain, to beg anything, but her lips were blue and her voice failed her. All she managed was a hoarse whisper, "Please, my baby." The man studied her for a long heartbeat. No questions, no judgment, no hesitation. He stepped aside, opening the door wider, and spoke his first and only word, "Inside." And for the first time in days, Eva felt the smallest flicker of safety. Stepping inside the ranch house was like entering another world. The storm's fury still howled outside, but here, warmth wrapped around Eva and her baby like a protective blanket. The sharp bite of cold was gone, replaced by the gentle heat from a crackling fireplace. The scent of burning wood mingled with something faintly earthy, horses, hay, and the faint musk of a man who lived alone in the wild. Eva inhaled deeply, letting the scent ground her after days of uncertainty and fear. The rancher, Rhett Carson, stood near the doorway, a silent sentinel in the dim light. His presence was imposing, yet strangely reassuring. Tall and broad, with shoulders hardened by years of labor, he didn't speak beyond that first word. But there was an intensity in his eyes that conveyed far more than words ever could. They were the eyes of a man who had seen hardship, loss, and solitude, but also the quiet strength to endure it. Eva, shivering and exhausted, struggled to find words. She opened her mouth, intending to explain her situation, perhaps to beg for help, but nothing coherent came out. All she could do was clutch her baby tighter, rocking the infant gently in hopes of calming her small, trembling body. The child, sensing the shift from cold terror to relative safety, relaxed slightly, her tiny arms resting against Eva's chest. Rhett didn't speak. He simply gestured toward a chair by the fire, and with slow, deliberate movements, he brought over a blanket and placed it over Eva's shoulders. His hands were calloused and rough, but the gesture was careful, almost tender. Though words were sparse, his actions communicated an understanding that was almost unnatural in their precision. Every motion suggested a man who had lived quietly, surviving hardships that had honed him into someone efficient, observant, and utterly dependable. Eva's eyes swept around the room. It was modest but well kept, evidence that someone lived here alone, yet cared deeply for the space. A worn rug covered the floorboards, and simple furniture lined the walls, sturdy, functional, but without unnecessary adornments. A kitchen table bore a few dishes, clean and ready, and shelves held jars of preserved food. Nothing flashy, nothing unnecessary, just the essentials for survival. Rhett moved quietly to the hearth, placing another log onto the fire. Sparks leaped and hissed, casting warm shadows across the room. He glanced at Eva, his gaze calm and assessing, and then returned to tending the flames. No questions were asked. No demands were made. He didn't ask where she had come from, why she was wandering in the storm, or what danger pursued her. He simply provided shelter. For Eva, this was both comforting and unnerving. People weren't usually this kind, or perhaps they were, but she had been too wary to notice. She had grown accustomed to suspicion and caution, expecting judgment or rejection at every turn. Rhett's quiet assistance was almost shocking in its simplicity. And yet, in that silence, she felt something profoundly human, a promise that she and her child were safe, at least for the moment. Finally, after a few tense minutes, Eva allowed herself to relax slightly. She sank into the chair by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her frozen limbs. Her baby stirred but did not cry, sensing the calm that permeated the room. And though Rhett remained mostly silent, his eyes never left her, scanning, protective, vigilant. In that first night, Eva realized that help didn't always come in words. Sometimes, it came in quiet gestures, in steady presence, in a single word spoken at precisely the right moment. And in the depth of a raging storm, that single word inside meant more than Eva could yet understand. The storm raged on, outside, relentless and unyielding, but inside the ranch house, time seemed to slow. The warmth from the fireplace wrapped Eva and her baby in a cocoon of safety, yet her mind refused to fully relax. She had learned long ago that safety was fragile, often fleeting, and trust, even when offered freely, was a dangerous gamble. And yet, here she was, alone with a stranger whose only spoken word had been inside. Rhett moved quietly around the room, tending to the fire, checking the doors, and straightening the few furnishings with a precision that suggested decades of solitary living. He didn't ask her name, her story, or why she was wandering in the storm. He simply provided what she needed: warmth, food, and shelter. His silence was unsettling, yet oddly reassuring. There was no judgment, no prying, only a steady, watchful presence that seemed to envelop the room as completely as the firelight. Eva couldn't help but observe him. His hands, thick and calloused from years of ranch work, moved with deliberate care. Every motion was economical but purposeful. He fed the fire without spilling embers, adjusted the blankets without disturbing the baby, and even fetched a cup of water for her with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with his imposing appearance. Despite the rugged exterior, there was a subtle gentleness in his movements, a careful attentiveness that didn't go unnoticed. Still, she remained wary. Why is he helping me? She wondered. Why would a man like this, living alone, offer shelter to a complete stranger in the middle of a blizzard? Her mind spun with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Perhaps he had an ulterior motive. Perhaps he was testing her, sizing her up, deciding if she was worth saving. She forced herself to push the thought away. The cold and exhaustion left her little room for overthinking. She needed to survive tonight, and she needed the fire to reach her fingers and toes before frostbite took hold. Rhett, sensing her unease, didn't force conversation. Instead, he simply moved with quiet competence, allowing her to adjust to the warmth and safety without intrusion. He set out a simple meal, a bowl of broth and a piece of bread. He placed it within reach of the chair by the fire and stepped back, his eyes meeting hers only briefly. That glance carried more reassurance than words could convey, a silent message that she was welcome here, if only for the night. Eva accepted the food cautiously, unsure whether to speak. Her voice came out as a whisper, hoarse from the cold. "Thank you," she managed. It felt inadequate, but it was all she could offer. Rhett inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his expression neutral but not unkind. The baby stirred in her arms, tiny fists reaching for warmth, and Eva rocked her gently. She realized for the first time since the journey began that she could breathe, even just a little. The fire's warmth seeped into her bones, and the quiet presence of the rancher reassured her more than she had expected. Yet the suspicion lingered like a shadow in the corner of her mind. She knew better than to fully trust someone she barely knew. But for the first time in days, Eva allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible feeling of hope. She was safe for now, under this man's roof, shielded from the storm. And though the rancher spoke almost nothing, his actions had already told her more than any words ever could. In the stillness of the night, Eva realized that sometimes silence spoke louder than conversation, and that for the first time, she might have found a kind of sanctuary in a place she had never expected: the quiet, watchful ranch of a man named Rhett Carson. Morning light filtered through the frost-lined windows, painting the small ranch house in muted shades of gold and silver. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in snow and eerily quiet. Inside, however, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. Eva sat near the fire, the baby dozing peacefully in her arms, as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was safe for the moment, but she could feel the lingering tension in the room, the kind that accompanies shared spaces between strangers. Rhett Carson moved about the house with the same quiet efficiency as the night before, preparing breakfast, stacking firewood, and checking the locks on the doors and windows. He offered no words beyond the occasional grunt or nod, yet his presence was comforting in a strange, unspoken way. Eva realized she didn't know his story, his reasons for living alone, or what had led him to become the quiet, watchful man he was. But there was something in his eyes, a depth of experience, that made her feel as though he understood more than she could articulate. Feeling a tentative courage, Eva began to speak. At first, her words were cautious, fragmented, as though testing the waters before plunging in. She told him about the homestead she had once called home, a place that had once been safe and warm, filled with laughter and routine. Then came the darker parts: the debt, the threats, the disappearance of her husband, and the relentless pressure from those who wanted to claim her and her child. Every word was heavy with the fear and exhaustion she had carried for weeks. Rhett listened. He did not interrupt, he did not judge. He merely watched, his eyes calm, attentive, and unwavering. In the silence that followed each part of her story, Eva felt the oddest sensation: relief. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have to guard her words, twist them to hide her vulnerability, or mask her fear. Here was a man who could hear everything she had endured and still offered nothing but steady, unassuming support. And yet, as she spoke, Eva noticed glimpses of his own pain. The quiet, the carefully controlled movements. The way his eyes seemed to carry stories he had never told. She recognized in him the kind of isolation that comes not from choice but from life's cruelty. She realized that while she was exposing her wounds, he was silently revealing his own in the smallest gestures: the tightening of his jaw, the brief furrow of his brow, the fleeting softness in his gaze when he looked at her or the baby. By mid-morning, the room had become a place of fragile trust. Eva, though wary, allowed herself to share more. Speaking of hopes she had once dared to dream for her child, dreams that now seemed distant and fragile. Rhett responded, not with words, but with actions that spoke volumes: fetching a fresh blanket, adjusting the fire, ensuring the baby's comfort. In this quiet routine, a silent understanding formed between them, a bond forged, not in conversation, but in the mutual recognition of survival, pain, and endurance. Eva realized that they were alike in unexpected ways. Both had been shaped by loss and hardship. Both had learned to carry the weight of the world silently. And both had, in their own ways, been forced to trust very few people. Yet here, under the same roof, in a small house surrounded by snow, they were discovering the possibility of trust. However tentative it might be, by the time the sun climbed higher in the sky, Eva had allowed herself the first real sense of hope in weeks. Perhaps she had found not only refuge from the storm, but also a man whose silence could speak volumes, whose quiet strength might offer something she had long thought impossible: protection, understanding, and maybe, in time, a place to call home. The tranquility of the morning felt fragile, almost deceptive. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed, sparkling under the pale sun, giving the impression that the storm had erased all threats. But Rhett Carson knew the land too well to trust appearances. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon as he worked outside, repairing a section of the fence broken by winter winds. There was a tension in his movements that Eva noticed, even if she didn't yet understand its reason. Something told her that safety, even here, was never guaranteed. It wasn't long before the warning signs appeared. Tracks in the snow, fresh, deep, and purposeful, led from the distant hills toward the ranch. Eva noticed them first, her heart lurching as she realized they were too large and too deliberate to belong to an animal. Fear gripped her chest as she glanced at Rhett, whose gaze immediately followed hers. The calm, silent assurance she had come to rely on was still there, but now it carried a sharp edge, a readiness to act. The riders appeared over the ridge. Cloaked in dark coats that blended with the winter shadows, mounted on horseback, they moved with intent, eyes fixed on the ranch. Eva's mind raced. She recognized them from her past: men who had been sent to enforce the debt her late husband had left behind. Men who believed the child should be handed over as payment. She clutched the baby tighter, trying to shrink into herself, praying she had misjudged the situation. But the hard truth was undeniable. Danger had arrived, and it was closer than she had hoped. Rhett's response was immediate but silent. He didn't panic, didn't shout. Instead, he moved with practiced precision, the kind born of years alone in the wilderness, accustomed to facing threats without relying on others. He secured the doors and windows, ensuring every latch was fastened, every barrier solid. His rifle was already in hand, the weight familiar and reassuring. For the first time, Eva saw the full extent of the quiet strength that had been hinted at since the stormy night. As the riders drew nearer, the tension in the air thickened. Eva's fear was palpable, yet in the midst of it, she felt a strange sense of calm. Rhett's presence was a shield, and his unwavering focus gave her hope that they might withstand whatever was coming. He moved the baby to a safe corner near the fire, arranging blankets and ensuring she was out of harm's way. Every action was deliberate, careful, and protective. When the riders finally reached the edge of the property, their shouts carried over the snow, demanding that Eva be handed over. Rhett stepped into the doorway, the rifle raised but steady, his figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the light inside the house. His voice was calm, quiet, and absolute. "You're safe here. No negotiations. No threats, just a statement of fact." as if the words themselves were enough to deter those who dared challenge him. Eva watched, heart pounding. As the tension escalated, she realized that the man who had spoken so little had mastered a language of strength and authority, far more powerful than words alone. The moment became a test, not just of courage, but of trust. She had placed herself in the hands of a man who spoke softly or rarely, but whose actions conveyed an unwavering promise of protection. As the first confrontation loomed, Eva felt a mixture of fear and awe. The storm outside had been harsh, but the danger at the door was sharper, more personal. And yet, with Rhett standing between her and the threat, she finally understood the depth of his silent guardianship. He was no ordinary man. He was a fortnight fell heavy and fast over the snow-covered plains, turning the ranch into an isolated island in a sea of white. The wind had died down, leaving a brittle silence that pressed against the house, broken only by the occasional crunch of hooves in the snow. Eva clutched her baby tightly, listening to each sound with a mounting sense of dread. The ridersmen from her past, men who believed her child belonged to them, had circled the property, waiting, watching, and their intentions were unmistakable. Rhett Carson moved with quiet precision, preparing for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. He didn't shout orders or rally defenses loudly. Instead, he moved like a shadow, checking windows, reinforcing doors, and ensuring every angle of the ranch was secure. His rifle rested firmly in his hands, the weight familiar, comforting to him, and, by extension, to Eva. Every step he took was calculated, deliberate, designed to protect the fragile sanctuary of his home and the two lives now entrusted to him. The first horse appeared over the rise, its rider shouting demands for Eva to step outside. Fear surged through her, and she instinctively shrank back toward the corner where Rhett had placed her and her child. The men's voices were harsh, filled with entitlement and menace, each word a threat carved into the cold night air. They believed in their claim, in their authority to take her, and even knew the consequences of refusal would be brutal. Rhett stepped forward, his figure calm and commanding. The rifle in his hands was steady, unwavering, aimed not with panic but with certainty. His voice, low and controlled, cut through the tension. She stays. You leave. There was no negotiation, no hesitation, only the absolute authority of a man who would not be moved. The standoff was tense and perilous. Snow crunched under the horse's hooves as the riders edged closer, testing him, seeing if his silence could be broken by fear or doubt. Rhett's eyes never wavered. He shifted slightly, ensuring the baby and Eva were completely shielded by the walls of the house, his every motion designed to protect them first. Then, with sudden aggression, one of the men made a move toward the door. Rhett reacted instantly, stepping into the doorway, weapon raised, every muscle coiled like a predator. Shots rang out sharp, echoing through the frozen plains. Rhett's aim was precise, not reckless. His goal was to defend, not to harm unnecessarily. Amid the gunfire, Eva huddled over her baby, covering her ears, praying silently for the violence to end. In the chaos, she realized the depth of Rhett's strength. He did not panic. He did not falter. Every action was controlled, purposeful, protective. The men, unprepared for such unflinching defense, faltered themselves. Some retreated, others were rounded up by the local sheriff, who had arrived just in time to assist. When the dust settled and the threat finally dissolved, silence returned to the ranch, but it was different now. It was the silence of survival, of victory, of a battle fought not just with weapons, but with courage and quiet determination. Eva's hands shook as she held her baby, relief washing over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly safe. And for the first time, she saw Rhett not just as a stranger, but as a guardian, a protector who had risked everything without words to keep them both alive. That night, she understood the power of his silence, the strength behind the man who spoke so little, but acted with absolute resolve. As the fire crackled warmly and the snow settled around the ranch, Eva realized something profound. The storm outside had been nothing compared to the storm they had just weathered together, and in surviving it, a bond had been forged, silent, steadfast, and unbreakable. In human form. And tonight, that fortress would not falter. The morning after the confrontation dawned clear and cold. The snow outside sparkled under the pale sunlight, untouched except for the footprints of those who had come and gone in the night. Inside the ranch, however, the atmosphere was heavy with relief, exhaustion, and a subtle, unspoken shift between Eva and Rhett. The storm of violence had passed, leaving in its wake a fragile sense of safety and a growing recognition of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of danger. Eva sat near the fire, cradling her baby, whose tiny fingers clutched her mother's sleeve as if to anchor herself to something steady and safe. She felt a deep, profound gratitude toward the man who had risked himself for them. Rhett Carson, the silent, imposing rancher who spoke little but acted with absolute certainty, was no longer just a stranger. He had become a guardian, a presence she could rely on when the world outside offered nothing but threats and uncertainty. The sheriff had arrived shortly after the confrontation, taking the remaining pursuers into custody. Their departure left the ranch quiet once more, but Eva's unease lingered. She had learned the hard way that danger could arrive without warning. She wondered if staying here, in this remote place, might invite further threats. She spoke hesitantly, her voice soft and uncertain. Maybe I should leave. I don't want to be a burden. Rhett looked at her, his expression calm but serious. For the first time since she had arrived, he spoke more than a single word. Stay if you want, he said simply. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an offer. And in that offer, Eva felt the weight of sincerity. He wasn't asking her to repay him or prove herself. He was giving her a choice, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning. Days passed, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch began to settle over them both. Eva helped with chores, fetching water, feeding the animals, and tending to the house. Rhett, who had lived in solitary routine for years, began to allow her presence in his daily life. He was still reserved, still speaking sparingly. But the smallest gestures, an offered cup of water, a subtle smile, a hand steadying a loose board, spoke volumes. Through these quiet interactions, trust grew. Tentative but undeniable, Eva began to see the man behind the silence. Rhett was not cold or indifferent. He had simply been shaped by a life that demanded self-reliance and caution. He was a man who had loved and lost, who had been wounded by the world and had learned to shield himself with quiet strength. Now, in the presence of her child and her vulnerability, that shield softened, revealing glimpses of the compassion he had long hidden. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the snow, Eva watched Rhett tending the fire. The baby giggled, reaching for him, and for the first time, he laughed a low, warm sound that filled the room. Eva realized that in the small acts of daily life, in the protection and care he offered, a new kind of home had been created. It was not just a physical place, but a space of trust, safety, and shared resilience. Eva understood that she had found more than refuge from the storm. She had found a man whose quiet strength could anchor her and her child. And Rhett, in turn, had found someone who could bring warmth and life into a solitary existence that had known too much hardship. Together, they began to build something rare, a home forged, not just from timber and stone, but from courage, trust, and the unspoken promise of loyalty and care. By the end of the day, as the last light faded and the fire crackled warmly, Eva felt a profound sense of belonging. She no longer questioned whether she could trust this man. She already did, and in that trust, a fragile but enduring love began to take root, growing quietly in the safety of a ranch built not just on land, but on the strength of two resilient hearts. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the plains. Snow melted in patches under the tentative sun, and the crisp air carried the faint promise of spring. The ranch, once a quiet refuge from a merciless storm, now felt alive with a new rhythm shaped by routine, trust, and the quiet companionship that had begun to grow between Eva and Rhett. The days were filled with small, ordinary tasks, tending the animals, mending fences, chopping firewood, and preparing meals. Eva moved with ease around the ranch, learning its rhythm, and Rhett, ever silent but attentive, began to include her in the life he had long kept to himself. He still spoke sparingly, his words measured and deliberate, but his gestures and actions conveyed volumes. Every time he checked that the baby was warm, every time he offered a hand with a stubborn task, he communicated care that no words could fully capture. The baby's laughter became a fixture in the house, a sound that softened Rhett's stern features and drew genuine smiles from him. Eva noticed the transformation subtly unfolding. The rancher who had been a fortress of solitude was now allowing warmth, joy, and even vulnerability to enter his life. And she herself, once hardened by fear and the uncertainty of survival, felt her own heart opening in response. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of the fence along the edge of the property, Eva paused to watch Rhett. The way he moved, steady and deliberate, was both protective and reassuring. His quiet confidence had become a source of safety, not just for her and her child, but for herself. She realized that she could rely on him completely, that his presence was no longer merely protective, but deeply comforting. As the day faded into evening, the two of them stood near the barn, watching the sun dip behind the distant hills. Snow that remained on the ground sparkled in the golden light, casting long, soft shadows across the landscape. For the first time in weeks, Eva felt a profound sense of peace. Here, amidst the vast openness of the plains and the sturdy walls of the ranch, she and her child had found safety, warmth, and belonging. Rhett's eyes met hers, and in that glance was a silent understanding that needed no words. He stepped closer, his presence calm and reassuring, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. For the first time, he spoke, not out of necessity, but out of connection. Home. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of promise, security, and acceptance. In that moment, Eva knew that the ranch, the fire, and the snow-covered land were secondary. What truly mattered was the bond they had formed, the quiet, steadfast strength that had carried them through storms, both literal and metaphorical. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered softly against the walls, Eva tucked her baby into bed, feeling the warmth of love and protection that had grown steadily since that first night in the storm. Rhett settled nearby, silent but present, and for the first time, words felt almost unnecessary. Their lives, intertwined through shared hardship and quiet resilience, had created something enduring, a home, a sanctuary, and the fragile beginnings of love. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. Courage, trust, and compassion had turned strangers into family, fear into hope, and a lonely ranch into a place where hearts could finally find rest. And as the first stars of evening lit up the sky, Eva allowed herself to imagine the future, a life built not on fear or survival, but on warmth, care, and the promise of every new day together. The world outside could remain harsh and unpredictable, but here, in this quiet ranch, they had found something precious, something lasting, and something beautiful, a beginning of something truly warm.